Stanford University.
David Kennedy actually needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him a very brief one. What I was actually going to start by saying is, which is to all the students in the audience, he was my favorite professor when I was a student at Stanford. I know he doesn't want me to say that, but it's true. But
and
I
Jim
think
was my favorite student.
That's correct. And you, and you, and you. No, but I would say this. It's rare that, I mean, David is one of the great historians in American history, and now obviously one of the great living presidential historians and historians in the United States. You should all know that. But as a faculty member, what I care most about is people who are incredible scholars here who are also great teachers. And David fits the bill on both, which is an incredible statement. And we're going to have a number of visitors over the course of the quarter, like John Taylor, for example, and Ken Hara next week, who fit that bill well, bill as well. But no one, in my experience, in the years I've been here at Stanford, would meet that standard the same way David does. The other thing I would tell you is, a number of years ago, when then President Bill Clinton decided to come to one of the classes I was teaching at Stanford, his one request when he was at Stanford was that he could talk with David Kennedy. Should tell you something. And by the way, I will add that one of the questions, we got a bunch of questions tonight about Professor Kennedy's discussions with President Obama. And I just want to tell you in advance, we're not going to ask any of those questions tonight or discuss any of them, because those are off-the-record discussions. And so we did receive a number of online questions about some of the conversations that Professor Kennedy's had with President Obama. And that is actually not a topic we're going to cover. Just a couple of things in case you don't know it. For all you guys who took high school history, you probably know that Professor Kennedy's book, The American Pageant, A History of the Republic, is the most popular high school history textbook around. So many of you read that. That's what you got your basics in American history on. Many of you, probably most of you also know that David won the Pulitzer Prize for his great book, Freedom from Fear, The American People in Depression and War, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2000. He's also won the Bancroft Prize, the Francis Parkman Prize, many other scholarly prizes, academic honors, teaching honors, you name it. He is the Bill Lane director, or the director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West here at Stanford, which is a pioneering institute now looking at the future of the Western United States. He's an incredible expert on that, but tonight he's going to be talking about the presidency. And the little known fact I'll end with is the guy is a great fly fisherman. That is what you really need to know about David Kennedy. I have seen him haul in some very big trout. So he is going to give us some very big comments tonight. The format's about 40, 45 minutes from David Kennedy, and then Rob and I are going to come back up and have a dialogue and discussion with the questions you guys gave us. So, David Kennedy.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks to all of you for being here. I believe you said in the course of your remarks, Jim, that I was a person that needed no introduction. I once heard Henry Kissinger introduced with just exactly that statement and nothing more. The introducer said, and I now give you Henry Kissinger, a person who needs no introduction. And Kissinger came up to the microphone. I can't do the accent, so forgive me for that, but he said, it may be true that I am a man who needs no introduction, but I want you all to know there is no man alive who more enjoys hearing himself introduced than I. All right, well, this is a season for elections, plural. And indeed, the title of this course is Elections, plural, 2012. And without slighting all the other elections that are going on, I want to stand on the proposition here this evening that some elections are more equal than others, and in particular, the presidential election, I think, is the one that quite naturally commands most of our attention. So without slighting all the other elections that are going on for 435 congressional seats and 30-some Senate seats and all the state and local elections and so on, tonight's subject matter is the presidency, the history of the nature of the presidency, the history of the presidential nomination and election process. And all of this is by way of suggesting some ways to contextualize and get into historical perspective what we might legitimately expect from whomever is elected next month in our own presidential election. Now, it's been said by a lot of people, and probably more than once by me, that everything has a history. And you're going to get a lot of history in kind of rapid-fire fashion, I'm afraid, about the institution of the presidency tonight. But let's just start with a little more concrete material, some numbers. that give us a sense of the scale of this institution we're dealing with. There have been 44 presidents. All of them so far have been males. All but one of them has been a white male. All but one of them has been a Protestant white male. There have been 2 father-son successions in the presidency, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. There's been 1 grandfather-to-grandson succession, William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison. 16 presidents out of the 44 have been reelected, a minority of presidents reelected, an interesting observation in its own right. 3 presidents have arrived at the White House without popular majorities in the popular vote, Rutherford B. Hayes, Benjamin Harrison again, and George W. Bush. There's been 1 bachelor president. Anybody know who it was? It's a trick question in a sense. Anybody want to take a guess? No, he was a widower, but not a bachelor. Sorry? Well, here's the trick part of the question. He actually pronounced it Buchanan. So James Buchanan is the 1 bachelor president. Whether that had anything to do with the way he pronounced his name, I can't tell you. But he's the 1 out of the 44 who never married. 6 presidents have actually been widowers, 4 for their entire term and 2 for partial terms. Probably the single most important number to keep in mind about the president, and this will touch on a major theme of this presentation, is that the president, let's ignore the detail for the moment about the vice president. Let's just pretend the vice president and the president are a single political entity for the moment. The president and the vice president are 1 out of 536 elected officials in Washington, D.C. There are 435 voting members of the Congress, 1 delegate from D.C. and without a vote, and 100 members, of course, of the United States Senate. So that number, 1 out of 536 elected officials in Washington, D.C., begins to tell us something about the general story I'm going to try to urge upon you here this evening. The American presidency is a highly peculiar institution. It really has, especially when it was inaugurated in the 18th century, it had virtually no precedents. There were no real precedents in the history of the 13 American colonies. The executive function in the 13 colonies was exercised by governors. Governors were appointees of the crown. They were not elected, not directly accountable to the people over which they ruled. The president, of course, is responsible to the American electorate. There was no precedent for the institution of the presidency under the brief period of the Articles of Confederation. Between 1776 and 1787, there was no executive function built in to the Union that existed under the Articles of Confederation. So the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, among the many creative things that it did, it essentially invented this brand new political institution that we call the presidency. The person who's largely thought to be the father of the presidency, who argued most strenuously for investing the powers that are invested in the executive in the presidency in the Constitutional Convention, was James Wilson, a Scottish immigrant from the state of Pennsylvania. As I say, often thought of as the father of the Constitution. He wanted a direct election by all the people without regard to state of their residence, so the president could be understood easily as the representative of all the people. That's not what we got. We got instead the Electoral College. The Electoral College is a vestige of some 18th century thinking about the ways that executive power could be jacketed and constrained and confined and not allowed to get out of hand. It's an awkward institution. It's served us reasonably well over 2 centuries, but it is an anomaly and a curiosity in our system that persists from the 1780s. But the fact that we still have the Electoral College is a reminder of the great caution with which the founders and the framers of the Constitution went about creating this institution of the presidency and went about investing the president with the powers that he has. What we got was not only the Electoral College, but something that all of you who went to school in this country, at least, have probably studied long since and several times over, the system of checks and balances. The system of checks and balances is shorthand for a government of limited powers, a government whose authority and power is deliberately constrained by the chains of the Constitution, to adopt the phrase from Thomas Jefferson. So to leap ahead a bit where I'm going, we shouldn't be surprised when the authority of our federal government is limited in actual practice, because that's the way the system was designed at its outset more than 2 centuries ago. So the founders created the presidency. They did it in the context of wanting to create an executive authority, but very fearful of creating one that would essentially mimic the arbitrary authority of the crown. So they jacketed the presidency around with all kinds of constraints. They invested the president with executive power, to be sure, but they also invested the president with at least some legislative power. The president has the power of veto. That's a form of legislative power. And they also invested the president, curiously enough, with some judicial power. The power has the president to nominate persons to the federal judiciary, including, of course, the Supreme Court of the United States. But I just to strike a note or underline a note here that you're going to hear more of as we go forward this evening, James Wilson was on to something when he yearned for and advocated, though he didn't fully succeed, in making the president the product of a plebiscitarian process, of a process that would reference the authority of the president in the people of the United States without regard to their place of residence or their state of residence. We're going to hear a lot more about that as the evening goes on. But again, just to repeat once more, essentially I think the history of the presidency that I'm about to rehearse for you provides some kind of confirmation that we live in a system that was purpose-built in the late 18th century to be designedly, a designed-in characteristic, to be designedly difficult to operate. That's really what we mean by checks and balances, and we've created a political system, constitutionally based, that makes it very difficult to achieve this thing called presidential greatness. All right. So let's go forward to the 19th century, and I would suggest to you that with a handful of exceptions, possibly Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, and Abraham Lincoln, there are really no great presidential figures in the 19th century. That actually flows naturally from the conception of the presidency that is embodied in the Constitution of the 1780s. The framers and the founders thought that Congress would be the center of government. The Congress would be the place where politics would actually happen. And the president would be, to a large degree, the agent of the Congress. And in fact, the way presidential nominees were generated for the first 3 or 4 decades of the Republic's history, down into the 1820s or even 1830s, the way a person got nominated for the presidency was through the exercise of power by a congressional caucus. Congressional caucuses are replaced in the 1820s and 1830s by national nominating conventions. So there's a very important shift in the way somebody even could aspire to the presidency, from the route of going through a congressional caucus nomination to a national convention nomination. That happens in the context of the advent of Jacksonian democracy, mass democracy, enormous expansion of the electorate in the 1820s and 1830s. And we've evolved still further, so that nominating conventions today have really lost their essential function. I think there is not, off the top of my head, I'd say there hasn't been a convention since 1952 where balloting went beyond the first ballot of a convention. And as we all know, and we'll get to this in just a few minutes, in this era of primary elections, the result of the nominating process is in the bag before the national conventions ever meet. In fact, I was, as it happens, an elected delegate to the Democratic Convention. I was a Bradley delegate, didn't do Bill Bradley much good, to the Democratic Convention that nominated Al Gore in 2000. I was on the floor every night during business hours when the convention was in plenary session. And I know we nominated Al Gore because we all know the history of that. But if there was a moment when we actually took the ballot and nominated him, I missed it. I wasn't aware it was going on. And it's probably no accident that I missed it, because it probably went on while I was having a conversation with somebody, because nobody cared, because the result was already foreordained that he was going to be the nominee. So we've gone through an evolution of routes to the presidency, or pathways to the presidency, from congressional caucus nomination to national convention nomination, now to primary election nomination is the principal method by which we toss candidates up for competing for this office. Now, to the extent that this is true of the 19th century, that the presidency was seen as the creature of Congress, begins the century and goes through much of the early part of the century as the nominee of the congressional caucuses, this reflects, again, the reality of the system of the presidency, or the institution that's described in the Constitution. And let me make that a little more explicit. Article 1 of the Constitution is the article that talks about the powers delegated to the Congress, and, this is interesting language, the powers denied to the government. Article 1 uses the terms Congress and government almost synonymously. You would be forgiven as a casual reader of the document if you thought that they were, in fact, equivalent terms. And Article 1, laying out the prerogatives of the Congress, the powers denied to the Congress, granted to the Congress, how the Congress gets elected, and so on, has 51 paragraphs in it. 51 paragraphs in Article 1. Article 2 of the Constitution is the article that describes the election of and the functioning of the executive department, or the presidency. It has 13 paragraphs in it, not 51, but 13. 8 of those 13 paragraphs provide for the method of election of the president, laying out all the provisions of the Electoral College. 4 of those paragraphs of the 13 deal with the powers of the president, and 1 of those paragraphs deals with the ways to remove a president, the process of impeachment. So you put Article 1's 51 paragraphs dealing with the Congress and Article 2's 13 paragraphs dealing with the presidency, you get a sense, just from those raw numbers, of how the framers, the founders, conceived of the relative weight of the Congress and the presidency in the overall governmental scheme. And to repeat what I said a moment ago, the framers intended the executive to be largely the creature of the legislature, and in fact, that's how the first 5, 6, 7, 8 presidents actually got the nomination out of congressional caucuses. The one exception to what I've just said, and it's only a partial exception, and this is again part of the genius or perversity of our system of checks and balances, has to do with war powers. Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 11 gives the Congress the power to declare war, but it's Article 1 that says the president is the commander-in-chief. And that's probably the single most notorious division of authority in the federal Constitution, and it has constituted for over 200 years what the notable constitutional scholar Edwin Corwin once called an invitation to conflict. Right down to our own day, it's a running question whether the president or the Congress really has or should have the dominant voice in foreign affairs, and especially in military deployments. And I might just on that note give you another couple of numbers that illustrate how this ambiguity or division of authority plays out. The Congress is invested with the power to declare war. That is its constitutional prerogative. It's unambiguous in Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 11. Anyone know how many times the Congress of the United States has exercised its constitutional authority to declare war? 5 is the right answer. Anybody want to name the 5 times? We could do it in chronological order. That would appeal to my historian sensibility. Very good. You must have read the American pageant. That's absolutely right. War of 1812, Mexican War, Spanish-American War, World Wars I and II. A Congressional Research Service survey done a few years ago at the request of the Navy Department they were asked to inquire how many times has the United States deployed significant numbers of troops overseas, and the answer was 289. Now, the difference between 5 formal declarations of war and 289 overseas deployments tells us just on the numbers here, facially, we're in the presence of a pretty imperfect mechanism for really balancing out the constitutional system of dividing authority between the commander-in-chief, who can deploy those troops, and the Congress, which has the power to declare war. All right. As we pass into the 20th century, and again, I would just, another little pop quiz for you, I would just guess that more people in this room could name a longer list of congressional figures from the 19th century than could name 19th century presidents. I mean, probably everybody would get Jefferson and Jackson and Lincoln. Maybe somebody would get James K. Polk. Might come up with a couple of others. But I'll bet if we polled the audience here, the room, you get a lot of people who can name folks like Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, James G. Blaine, Stephen Douglas, William B. Reed, all congressional figures, not presidents. None of them made it to the presidency. And we rightly would conclude from this little exercise that, in fact, power resided principally in the Congress, and that was where these major figures arose. And the presidency was, in fact, not seen as all that enviable a political office. Now, something changes as we approach or enter the 20th century, and we begin to enter a period in which the presidency takes on characteristics that are recognizably modern, and we begin to see our own time, at least in inchoate form, in the emergence of this new system that begins roughly with the dawn of the 20th century. And increasingly, as the 20th century went on, the president was seen as at least the co-equal of the Congress in terms of national political authority and in terms of political leadership and initiative. Down to the point where today I would argue that there is a radical difference between the congressional and presidential wings of even the same party. I'll come back to that in a moment. And as somebody suggested to me recently, and I think this is a bit of a caricature but actually captures an important truth, that presidential candidates today essentially rent a party to advance their candidacy, and the party is forced to dance to their tune rather than the party, largely based in Congress, choosing who is to be president. That's an artifact of the primary selection process that has become such a big part of our political picture today. Now, in part, of course, this evolving nature of the presidency in the 20th century and the shift in the balance of power and authority, prestige, recognition between Congress and the presidency is rooted in real historical developments, not just formal political arrangements. Things like the maturation of the Industrial Revolution in this country toward the end of the 19th century, rapid urbanization, we're a majority urban people by 1920, enormous waves of immigration that arrived on these shores in the last part of the 19th century and first 15 years or so of the 20th century, and not least of all, the emerging international role of the United States, a role that this country simply did not play in any meaningful way for the first century and more of American nationhood, but it has increasingly played in the 20th century, even to the point where today it's widely understood that the United States is the world's hegemonic power. That's an enormous difference from the international standing of the United States a century and more ago. In these circumstances, it began to increasingly dawn on many people that the system of congressional government, the system where the Congress was the dominant actor in the national political scene, was simply no longer viable. That the kinds of issues of urbanization, industrialization, immigration, and international action that the country now that aspired to play, the roles it aspired to play or did play, called for some kind of more unified, centralized leadership, and the president was the person to provide it. In fact, the phrase I just used, congressional government, is the title of what to this day remains one of the most famous and trenchant analyses of the American political system ever written. It was written by a young PhD student. It was his dissertation, later published as a book called Congressional Government, written by one Woodrow Wilson in 1885. In the thesis, Wilson's thesis in 1885, and it is not accidental that the author of Congressional Government emerges roughly 30 years later as a pioneer of the modern redefinition of the presidency. The thesis of congressional government, the book that Wilson wrote in 1885, is that the lodging of power in the Congress was wasteful and dispersive of power, and power was fragmented, could not be exercised efficiently in this body of several hundred legislators, all of them representing their peculiar parochial interests of their district or state. And in fact, and even worse in his indictment, there was no accountability in this system. Power was so diffused and exercised so opaquely to the general public that you couldn't hold anyone accountable for what happened, good or bad. So here's a famous sentence, or three sentences actually, from congressional government that Woodrow Wilson wrote in 1885. He said, "This division of authority and concealment of responsibility are calculated to subject the government to a very distressing paralysis. Policy cannot be either prompt or straightforward when it must serve many masters. It must either equivocate or hesitate or fail altogether." Now, Wilson wrote that 127 years ago, and I submit to you it still sounds kind of familiar as a description of the way our national government works, or certainly the way it has been working recently. By the time Wilson considered running for the presidency and began writing about the presidency and then became president, of course, he asserted and attempted to play the role of a different kind of presidential leadership. And again, in one of the most widely quoted of his descriptions about the presidency, he said, "The president is at liberty in law and in conscience to be as big a man as he possibly can." Wilson was arguing that we need to change our conception of the presidency and make the president the person who was invested with the power and the authority to actually get things done. That was impossible in the system of fragmented and dispersed power. That was the spectacle he saw in the United States Congress. Here's another of Wilson's observations on the same subject. He said, "Let the president once win the admiration and confidence of the country, and no single force can withstand him. No combination of forces will easily overpower him. If he rightly interpret the national thought and boldly insist upon it, he is irresistible." Now, it might be observed that's exactly what the founders feared, that an executive invested with that kind of standing and authority and power would be dangerous to the liberties of the people and the health of the republic. But nonetheless, that yearning for someone with the authority, power, command to get the job done is as old as James Wilson at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And I just happened to see the other day a remark of Thomas Jefferson's from 1810, usually thought of as the patron for limited government. Here is what Jefferson said in a private letter in 1810. He said, "It is the duty of the chief magistrate," meaning the president, "to unite in himself the confidence of the whole people in order to produce an union of the powers of the whole and point them in a single direction as if all constituted but one body and mind." Now that comes from the pen of Thomas Jefferson, and again it reflects this yearning under certain circumstances for unity of action, unity and singularity of political power, authority, and control. All right, to repeat, in the early 20th century, in this context of more explicitly articulated desire for a more robust executive or presidential leadership, we begin to see some of the outlines emerging of what we take to be the modern presidency. And the three people who I would nominate as representing, in the early part of the 20th century, this kind of redefinition of the institution are, two of them seem quite familiar to, I suppose, in this connection, the other might not, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Herbert Hoover. And Hoover doesn't usually get mentioned in this company, but I think he belongs here for a very peculiar reason, or particular reason. Roosevelt and Wilson belong here for a very conspicuous reason. Partly for technological reasons having to do with the emergence of a widespread and widely disseminated and inexpensive popular press, newspapers in short, both Wilson and Roosevelt were absolute pioneers in using the power of what Roosevelt called the bully pulpit, using the, you might say, the advertising power, the media power, if you want to put it that way, of the presidency as a way to turn the public's opinion in certain directions, have the public put pressure on their congressional representatives. This was just not done in any very systematic way, partly because of technological limitations in the 19th century. But when Roosevelt intervened in the anthracite coal strike in 1902, or when Woodrow Wilson tried to get the Senate to pass the Treaty of Paris, the Versailles Treaty, in 1919, both of them relied primarily on a new instrument in the presidential political arsenal, and that was publicity, direct appeal to the people. And again, you see that James Wilson theme reemerging again. The president should be the one political actor who is the instrument of all the people acting in unison, and it is the people directly who form the basis of presidential authority. The other person who I said a moment ago I think belongs in this company, is beginning to define the presidency in terms that are recognizably modern, is Herbert Hoover, for one particular reason. Hoover, in fact, we know he was elected president in 1928, and many people in this room probably know he gave his acceptance speech in the old Stanford Stadium. His is one of the most unfortunate presidencies on record. But there it is. But it's probably less widely known that Hoover first ran for the presidency, not in 1928, but in 1920. And he tried to get the Republican nomination in 1920. It wasn't clear, in fact, until the 11th hour, whether he was a Democrat or a Republican. He'd lived outside the United States for most of his life, adult life. He'd cast his first ballot for president for Theodore Roosevelt on the so-called Bull Moose ticket, a kind of breakaway Republican ticket in 1912. He'd worked in the cabinet of a Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson. Both parties tried to recruit him or sought out his interest in the presidency in 1919, 1920. And he made a run for the Republican nomination, and here's the part that marks him as modern. The device he tried to rely on was the presidential primary election. The primary was a new device in 1920. The first presidential primary election was held in the state of Oregon in 1910. By the 1920s, there were about roughly 20 states that had primary elections. Most of them were so-called beauty contests. That is to say, they were a place where the voters could express their preferences, but they were in no way binding upon delegates to the national nominating convention. So they were not quite the primaries we see today, but nonetheless, Hoover is one of the first political actors in our historical system who saw the potential in primary elections as a way, as a newcomer to the political scene, really, somebody who'd only returned to the United States in 1917 or 1918 after a career abroad for 20 plus years, a way he could get himself in touch with the electorate and perhaps make his play for political power. Political primaries actually went out of fashion again, even though they were a kind of a weak version of what we know today. They went out of fashion in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, so that by the 1960s, only 12 states had primary elections. And then something happened. Again, we won't go into all the details, but by the end of the 1970s, virtually every state has a primary election or its equivalent caucus system. And in most of those states, the results of the primary elections are binding on delegates to the National Convention, thus rendering the conventions tableau that have no real business to conduct, but they simply ratify choices made in an earlier part of this sequence. All right, one last index about how the relation of the presidency and the president and Congress, president and people changed. Somebody's actually done this calculation. I didn't do it myself. In fact, I can't imagine doing it. It would drive you crazy to do it. But somebody actually measured how many times the President of the United States spoke directly to the people and, on the other hand, spoke directly to the Congress in the 19th century and in the 20th century. So somebody's gone through and coded every presidential utterance on the basis of to whom it was addressed, president or people. Again, I won't bore you with the methodology or all the granular result, but here's the net result. It was determined that in the 20th century, presidents spoke to the public at large 6 times more frequently than they did to the Congress. And they spoke to the Congress directly 1/4 as frequently as they did in the 19th century. So again, it's just a numerical way to capture this more robustly emerging plebiscitarian character of the presidency and the direct relationship between president and people, and the Congress gets pushed to the margins. Now, the great consolidator of these trends, not least of all with respect to the media, was the person who many of us think is probably the most consequential president of the 20th century, is Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was a master of the plebiscitarian aspects of the institution, not least of all because he mastered what in his day was a still fairly newfangled but extremely powerful medium of instantaneous mass communication, and that was the radio. Probably best known, his use of the radio is probably best attached to his so-called fireside chats. It comes as a surprise to many people to learn that over the 12 years of his presidency, he gave how many fireside chats? Anybody want to venture a guess? Well, the answer is 30. Most people guess hundreds. What he did do hundreds of were press conferences. He held press conferences almost without fail twice a week throughout his presidency, 337 recorded press conferences. And again, I won't go into all the details here. We can talk about it later if you like. But he set up his press conferences in a way that, again, put him in more direct contact with newspaper readers. He allowed himself to be quoted directly, which presidents didn't allow before that. He did not insist on pre-submitted questions. And he also kind of suckered the press into agreeing that some of his responses to questions they posed would be off the record. They couldn't print them, but they were to inform their understanding of issues. That was a way to co-opt the press, make them seem like they were an arm of government, and it worked very, very effectively. Again, on this note, I just had an occasion to see the other day some tabulation of how many press conferences recent presidents have had. Because Obama is the touchstone here, it's all calibrated to the first 3 years of their presidencies. So President Obama has had 30 press conferences in 3 years, not nearly Franklin Roosevelt's pace. George H.W. Bush had 76 press conferences in his first 3 years of office. Bill Clinton had 40. George W. Bush had 11. So Obama has reversed the trend a bit, but the trend line is still pretty clear that presidents have fewer press conferences. Obama, by contrast, has had 441 broadcast, televised, one-on-one interviews. So he's using the medium in a different way, not press conferences, but one-on-one interviews. What do we make of that? I'm not sure. In any case, just again to give you one bit of a quantitative index on this, when Franklin Roosevelt delivered his first fireside chat on the first Sunday after he was inaugurated, in the first or second week of March 1933. It was about the reopening of the banks. Every bank in the country had been closed for the preceding week. And he went on the air, one of these fireside chats, talked to people in their living rooms, talked to them over the radio from the White House as if he were their uncle, talking to them straight about what was going on in the country. Brand new way to use the medium of the radio, brand new way for a president to relate to the public at large. And the effects were just absolutely galvanic. In that week, after that first fireside chat, the White House received 450,000 letters from ordinary citizens. I've seen a lot of these letters in the Roosevelt Archive in Hyde Park, New York. They're written on butcher paper and school line tablets and you name it. And they testify powerfully, movingly actually, to the way that Roosevelt touched some chord out there in the public at large that they wrote him in these numbers. Herbert Hoover's White House mailroom had exactly one person whose job it was to handle correspondence from ordinary citizens. One person. The Roosevelt White House had to hire 70 people to maintain responses, courtesy responses to the volume of mail that came in to Roosevelt's White House over the next decade and more. So Roosevelt, there's a mystery to this. We don't really understand it all, how he actually did it. but this is just, I've just been giving you one way to quantify it. Roosevelt really established a model that other presidents have emulated for this direct communication with the American people and making them feel as if they had direct access to the President of the United States. There's a famous anecdote about Roosevelt's funeral in 1945, and the funeral cortege was going down the street in Washington, D.C., and many people were weeping, but one person was weeping more disconsolately than the others. And someone asked him, "You seem particularly moved by the death of the president. Did you know him?" And the person replied, "No, but he knew me." Now that's mysterious, how a political figure can establish that kind of relationship with millions of people out there. But Roosevelt did it. His use of the radio is surely one of the ways he did it. His use of the press, his manipulation of the press, if you want to put it that way, is certainly another part of it. But we see in him a real consolidation of this notion, as the great presidential election campaign historian Theodore White once put it. He said, "The supreme duty of the president is to protect us all against each other's congressmen." In other words, to protect us against the fragmenting of power, the parochialization of power, if that's a word. And again, it expresses this yearning for a single authority who can somehow make the system work. There are two other people, I think, who stand in this progression of further plebiscitarianizing the presidency. There's John F. Kennedy, who used the successor medium of television to make direct contact with the public at large. And in his case, there was a very deliberate and shrewd tactic that Kennedy adapted, and that was televising his press conferences. Roosevelt absolutely transformed the nature of press conferences, but Kennedy, in effect, made them redundant. If you had the press in the room asking the questions, the answers were televised, what did you need the newspaper for the next day to report it at all? It was an absolutely direct way for the public to hear what the president thought about a given issue. So televised press conferences, another step in this direction. Ronald Reagan, of course, becomes the acknowledged master of the use of television, both for set-piece speeches and for televised press conferences. And then we go on today to the president twittering and the use of social media and so on, and further doubling down on this whole trajectory of direct access between president and public. So, from Theodore Roosevelt in the early 20th century to the present, we see this new presidency emerging to what it has become in our own time. And in this institution are invested the accumulation of this series of fitful aspirations for stronger central government, for more powerful and accountable leadership. Leadership that operates apart from the Congress, and even to a certain extent operates apart from the president's own party. And this goes back again, I think, at least as far as Woodrow Wilson's observation in 1885, that congressional government was a formula for paralysis, fragmentation of power, opaque exercise of power, no accountability. The presidency was something we could see. We had direct access to it. We want to invest more authority there, but we're still trammeled by this constitutional system under which we live. And because of that constitutional system, I would suggest that the instances of successful presidential leadership, and by successful here I mean where a president really achieves his announced objective in a significant way, and where he can plausibly be said to have embodied, as Thomas Jefferson wrote, Woodrow Wilson wrote, the aspirations of all the people, or at least great majorities of them. The instances of that kind of thing are really quite rare and quite few and far between, especially if we just look at the period of the modern presidency in the 20th century. I'd say there are 4.5 such instances. Woodrow Wilson in 1913, when he passed the Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Trade Act, and major tariff reform. Franklin Roosevelt in 1933 and 1935, the 100 Days in 1933, and most especially the great durable reforms of 1935, such as the Social Security Act. Lyndon Johnson, 1964-65, when he passed the two Civil Rights Acts, Voting Rights Act, Immigration Reform. Medicare, Medicaid. Ronald Reagan in his first term, 1981-1983, fundamental overhaul of the tax system. That's 4. And then the 0.5, his judgment of history is not yet fully in on this, would be President Obama's first 2 years, 2009, 2010, not least of all with the passage of financial reform and the Affordable Health Care Act, the future of which we'll see about. My point is simply this, that we live in a system that is designed to make it difficult for the president to fulfill what are frequently our common yearnings for more effective, accountable, visible, and dramatic leadership. And this line of analysis, I think, leads us to a utterly predictable and maybe banal and surely boring conclusion. And that is that both the hopes and the fears about a president's capacity to perturb the political equilibrium, both the hopes and the fears, I think, are exaggerated. The probability is that without the quite unforeseeable or unimaginable event of a major constitutional overhaul, we're going to run within the terms of this system for as far into the political future as we can see, and that is our constitutional fate. So I'll end just with 2 remarks, that one of which goes back to the founding era, and the other comes from the pen of arguably the greatest American historian who ever put pen to paper, Henry Adams. But the first remark comes from a very famous document in American history, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, written in 1776. Those of you who've read it recently will remember that it is usually credited with being the document that convinced the American colonials that the right course of action was not to seek redress of their grievances with the British Crown, but rather to separate and become an independent country. But we sometimes forget that actually the first section of Common Sense is a treatise on the nature of government. And Paine eventually gets to the part about we should be an independent country, but he starts out talking about the vices of monarchy and the virtues of a republican form of government, small r. And in that part of the pamphlet, Common Sense, he said something that I think you will, if you're honest with yourselves, you will feel it resonate in our own political culture today. It's a rather famous formulation about the relationship between society and government. And here's what he said. He said, society is produced by our wants and government by wickedness. The former, that's society, promotes our happiness positively by uniting our affections. The latter, government, negatively by restraining our vices. Society is a blessing, but government is but a necessary evil. Now, you hear that refrain echoed almost verbatim, you might say, in Ronald Reagan's famous formulation that government is not the solution, government is the problem. This is deep in our historical, political, culture DNA. Our suspicion of government, our suspicion of government power, even though alongside that there sits our desire that government somehow be more effective, more robust, and more active. So that's the constitutional system we live in. And again, I'll just conclude here finally with a remark of Henry Adams, great historian of the 19th, early 20th century. His masterwork, it's only 8 volumes. You can read it over a weekend or 2. And it covers 16 years of American history. It's called A History of the United States During the Administrations of Jefferson and Madison. In my mind, the best piece of American history ever written. But here is one of his summary conclusions in that book. He said, the great object of terror and suspicion to the people of the 13 provinces was power. Not merely power in the hands of a president or a prince, of one assembly or several, of many citizens or few, but power in the abstract, wherever it existed and under whatever form it was known. So I'll stop there and we'll pass to the next phase of this outing.
Okay. So what we're going to do now is put Professor Kennedy on the hot seat. And we have taken the questions. Rob actually compiled You guys voted on the questions that you sent. We have hundreds of questions. But I want to just start off and ask you this question. So David, you said that Obama is 4.5, right? If he's reelected, what are the odds that he could actually be a great president or a truly impactful president? And what are the characteristics of that he'd have to do other than having passed the health care and the financial reform deal?
Well, I withheld the second 0.5 simply for the reason that the two big reforms that we got in the first term were Dodd-Frank, financial reform, and the Affordable Care Act. And I don't think the future of them is entirely understood yet, exactly how they're going to play out. So I'm just hedging my bet with holding final judgment until we see. It would surprise me personally if either one of those were repealed, even though Governor Romney has said he'll repeal the Affordable Health Care Act in his first day in office. Somebody wrote, I think, in the Times this morning, Governor Romney meet the Congress, so the Congress does have something to say about that. But we still don't know how they're going to play. We don't know if they're going to have a history like Medicare, Medicaid, Civil Rights Act, Social Security, the things that really define those great moments of presidential accomplishment that I talked about earlier.
Okay, Rob?
So one of the questions that was asked relatively frequently online touches on one of the themes, the major theme of your presentation, namely the constrained and jacketed power of the presidency in a system of checks and balances, but also viewing or being aware of the expansion of the power of the presidency in the 20th century. One of the things which you mentioned it briefly at the start of the presentation by noting that it was 280 plus foreign deployments of the US military, with only 5 of those voted on by the US Congress as a condition or a state of warfare. And because of the arrival of the US as a superpower on the international scene and its growing and almost hegemonic influence, as you described it, how should we think about the power of the presidency just with respect to foreign policy? Isn't that a place where its power really is much less jacketed than the story you wanted to tell?
Yeah, let me back up. I will answer that part of the explicit part of your question, but let me just take the opportunity to add something else where I thought you were going with your question. There are several things have changed roughly in our lifetimes, you might say, the last 2-3 generations, that create a wholly different context within which the presidency operates. And foreign policy is certainly part of it. I'll come to that in just a moment. But the other is, quite simply, the growth of the federal government. And that's partly a post-New Deal proposition, but it's also a post-Great Society proposition, even post-Richard Nixon. Things like the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Environmental Protection Act, come from the Nixon administration. So it's not just Democratic presidents who expanded the scope of the federal government. And many of those, virtually all of those additions or increments to what the federal government does are lodged in the executive branch. So this has, by its very nature, expanded the nature of the presidency, the authority of the presidency. And I should have acknowledged that more clearly when I was up there at the platform. But now let me turn to the other part of your explicit question. There have been several efforts in relatively recent times, going back to the 1970s, if I can put it this way, rejacket the power of the presidency in foreign affairs. The most notable is the War Powers Act of 1973, which did impose temporal limits on the president's authority to deploy troops in substantial numbers. This gets a little arcane and wonky maybe, but there was a parallel development in the structure of the military. It's the brainchild of a general by the name of Creighton Abrams. It's called the Total Force Doctrine. And Abrams tried to compose or configure the armed forces in such a way that the president would be required to call up the reserves for any large-scale or long-term deployment. Calling up the reserves disrupts civilian society more than just deploying the active duty force. So it would be a kind of extra constitutional constraint on the president's power. Point is that this issue hasn't gone away in our time, though many presidents have exercised tremendous discretionary power in terms of foreign policy and military deployments. The most recent example, I suppose, of this, of any conspicuous size, would be President Obama's actions with respect to Libya, without any congressional voice in that matter of any consequence. So yeah, this is clearly an area in which presidents find they have scope for action, and they don't have to deal with all those troublesome poos over there on Capitol Hill. So it's not an accident that there's a certain pattern you can see in the Cold War period and beyond, where presidents' second terms tend to be more heavily invested in foreign policy issues than first terms. I would say not least of all, and this oversimplifies things greatly, but not least of all because they get so frustrated dealing with the Congress in their first term that they turn to a field of action where there's less constraint.
Just a quick follow-up on that then. So tomorrow's presidential debate, the first one, is going to be on domestic policy, and there'll be a later debate on foreign policy. Why do you think that the electorate doesn't recognize this disjunction more generally and view the election of a president as much more consequential for foreign policy, and rather than invest so much in domestic policy in which the president's power is so constrained?
Well, we'll talk about this a lot more on the evening when foreign policy is our focus. But suffice it to say, here's a structural paradox or contradiction about our society. A majority of Americans do not have or never have had a passport. And we can take that as a proxy for their, crude proxy, for their degree of interest in foreign affairs, generally speaking. And yet we are the country that wields hegemonic power in the world, diplomatically, economically, culturally, politically, militarily, so on and so forth. Those two facts don't sit well together. A country that wields such enormous power, but where citizens, a majority of citizens, really, apparently, don't take much interest in this. And again, as we'll discuss, I presume, in some detail, when Mike Armacost is here, talking about the election and foreign policy, there's relatively few elections in the period since the United States has been a major power, 20th century, Cold War especially. Relatively few elections where foreign policy issues really made a difference.
Right.
Although, David, let me take up on that one for a second. Then I want to, but if you look at George W. Bush, right? This is just contrast to to that overall picture. So George W. Bush in his first term invaded Iraq, right? Had 9/11 and then turned around in whatever it was, a year later, or almost a year later, invaded Iraq. So his presidency is largely defined by what he did in his first term, and by the consequences, some would argue quite disastrous, of those decisions. Very different. In fact, hard to think of the domestic policy stuff that he did, other than the reality when he was getting out of office in 2008, the economy wasn't exactly in great shape.
There's no child left behind. There's tax.
Fair enough. And those were in his first. Why do you think Obama? I mean, other than the Osama bin Laden, so I actually think this is really interesting. You've had and there's sort of the pathetic discussions back and forth between Romney and Obama about what happened at the Libyan consulate, if you can call it that. So why have there been so little discussion in this presidential race, and why has Obama done so little to show that up? If that is an area where, truthfully, his leadership is at the height.
Can you boil your question down to a simple interrogatory sentence?
Basically, why has there been so? It's sort of a follow-up on Rob's. Why has there been so little focus on this in this presidential campaign? And we're going to have Armacost and Mike McCurry here, who's the chairman of the debates for the foreign policy debate. Why haven't they gone there with this? It's part of the campaign. Is it they just think the public is so uninterested?
Are we going to have that class after the foreign policy debate?
Yeah, it's coming right the night after the foreign policy debate.
Part of me wants to let's defer this discussion until then. But again, I'm just sort of kind of off the top of my head reaction. I would say that the Romney campaign, rather wisely, up until quite recently, has decided not to make foreign policy a major point of attack because, on balance, I think Obama's foreign policy has been pretty successful. He's wound down 2 wars, or the process of winding down the second one. He's avoided what could have been a lot of rash actions, impetuous actions in the Middle East. I think he is, my own view is he's managing with considerable skill this unbelievably complicated, delicate matter of Asia, the so-called pivot to Asia, and the management of China's further ascendancy on the world stage. So I don't think there are many points of entry for Romney. And in fact, I was surprised that he's making a point. He had an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal a day or two ago about Obama's Middle East policy. It seems to me he's attacking where he has very little to offer, and Obama has some considerable strengths to counter him with. So I don't get that as a campaign tactic.
Okay, Rob?
So there were two related questions that came up from a bunch of students in the class that wanted to know something about why it is that there has never been a robust opportunity for a third party to emerge. And this isn't only, of course, related specifically to the presidency, but more generally. And then separately, but in a related way, if you could situate the emergence of the Tea Party in the kind of populist traditions of the US. So to the extent that we can explain historically why third-party candidates have had such a difficult time emerging, and then separately how to think about the Tea Party today.
Well, the first part is actually, there's a pretty simple, straightforward answer to that. It's because we don't have proportional representation, and we have a system of first past the post, winner take all. Right. So it's very difficult for third parties to even get up over the threshold where they can be a presence in any legislative body or whatever. So there are other political systems in the world. A lot of the European countries have proportional representation. It's an interesting argument we could have, which one is more or less efficient when you get a parliamentary or a legislative body that's composed of 8, 10, 15 different parties and continually shifting coalitions and rearrangements and so on. You get something like the Italian government after World War II had 67 governments in 32 years or whatever the numbers were, because they're always rearranging these coalitions. So our system has some problems in allowing for the expression of sentiments that would in another system be organized as a third party. The failure to emerge, there's one party, style of party I should say, the failure of which to emerge has long been a puzzle, and that's a workers' party or a working class party or a labor party. We've never had any such thing on any scale whatsoever. There's a small body of literature, most of it generated at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, about why that's the case. The most famous specimen of that literature is by a German economist by the name of Werner Sombart, who wrote a book in 1911 or 12 called "Why is there no socialism in the United States?" You could rewrite the question, why is there no workers' party in the United States? And he had a lot of different explanations, and some of them are more arcane than others, but one of the central things that he talked about was that unlike the working class in countries like Britain and Germany and France and Italy, ours was so ethnically and linguistically and religiously and culturally fragmented that there was no cultural basis on which a working class could come together and then make common political cause. So it was just a tougher job to organize on a class basis when you had so many internal divisions of a cultural sort in the American working class, which was not the case in other countries' working classes. So there are structural reasons as well as cultural reasons, I think, why we haven't had any such thing.
And how about the Tea Party?
Well, you know, again, to be honest, I'm not quite sure what the Tea Party is all about. Or to put it a little more concretely, maybe, I'm not sure who composes it, who are its members or adherents. You hear things about its real agenda is a thinly encrypted racism and nativism. I'm not sure that's true. It might be. I just don't really have an opinion about that. But I do think what they say publicly, insofar as I've consumed any of that stuff, it does seem to me they're working a recognizable vein of historic American political culture. It's the one I gave you some examples of at the end of my remarks. This fear of power, this fear of big government, the ease with which the word socialist comes to people's lips. So President Obama is a socialist. If you ask somebody, well, what's your definition of socialism? The usual response you'll get in this country, well, it's big government. Well, that's not exactly what we mean by socialism. There's a good definition of socialism. It's public ownership of the means of production. We don't have that. We didn't nationalize the banks. We briefly nationalized the automobile industry and gave it right back to them. We don't do that kind of stuff. But the equation made between socialism and big government comes easily, I think, to parts of our political culture and our society, and it seems to me that's the vein that Tea Party is tapping, and it's a familiar vein. There's nothing really new about it.
So we got a lot of questions from the audience about the Electoral College, and then last week we had Chris Lehane and McKinnon, both of whom had differing opinions based on their experiences in 2000 about the Electoral College. Do you think we should get rid of the Electoral College?
You know, my honest answer is it doesn't matter what you or I think about whether we should get rid of it, because it's not going to go away. And it's not going to go away for a very simple reason, and it's called the senatorial bonus. That every state has a minimum of 3 votes in the Electoral College, 2 senators, and you can't have less than 1 representative. Electoral College is, as you all know, I'm sure, it mirrors the distribution of seats in the Congress. That's why states grow or shrink or whatever relative to others. They get more or fewer Electoral College votes. But there are enough states that get the senatorial bonus, that minimum of 2 or 3 seats, that they will never agree to a constitutional amendment to get rid of it. There are workarounds that have been tried in a few places, like states can decide to allocate their Electoral College vote on the basis of congressional districts rather than the state as a whole. I think Colorado tried that and it didn't work, and I think there's a New England state that maybe does it. But those examples are scattered and few and far between. There's too much vested interest in too many states, most of them thinly populated states, in the Electoral College as it sits, that there'd have to be, I mean, if there ever was an occasion when the public at large might demand a constitutional change, it was 2000. When a lot of people felt the Electoral College constituted part of the gimmick that had been gamed to throw the election the way it went. And even in that context, you couldn't get a serious grassroots or other kind of effort mounted to get rid of the Electoral College. So don't bet the farm on it.
Okay. So let me follow up and ask a question about your remarks. So you said as the presidency has, in modern times has been defined, that oftentimes the candidates rent the party. So I'd ask you, did Romney rent the Republican Party, or did the Republican Party rent Mitt Romney this time?
It's a good question, and I was going out on a limb a bit when I used the rent-a-party observation. But look, it's, if you go back, for example, to John F. Kennedy's run for the presidency, he knew that he could almost certainly not get the party bosses to support his nomination, or not enough of them to support it. And interestingly, if you read Chris Matthews' recent book about John F. Kennedy, it's something that I was reminded of forcefully in the book. He talks about how the big Catholic governors, including Pat Brown in California, were wary of Kennedy's candidacy because they thought it might excite the religious issue in a way that would come back to bite them. So it's a paradox, or something we wouldn't have expected. So he knew that the only way he was going to force his way through to the nomination was to show well in the relatively small number of primaries that then existed. So he forced the Democratic Party to accept him. It wasn't that the party fathers anointed him. It was the other way around. And now, after the great reforms in the Democratic Party's nominating process following the convention of 1968, and the Republican Party followed suit, by the end of the 1970s or soon thereafter, virtually every state has a primary. And the primaries are the way that candidates seek office. They raise their own money. They may or may not have major help from their party central committee in the primary campaign. They probably don't, because there's several people competing for the same nomination. Presidential candidates are almost independent actors, and they choose to act in the context of one or the other party, but they better have some prior affiliation with that party to even be plausible, but they don't have to dance to the party's tune, the way they did in the days of the famous smoke-filled room.
But put that in the context of Mitt Romney now running on the Republican ticket.
Well, I think your question is the way you put it is a good one. Who rented whom? What did he have to do to satisfy the Republican electorate who showed up in the primaries?
Correct.
That's not the same as the party bosses. So again, it's a familiar phenomenon that the kinds of closed primary systems that most states have favor candidates who are more farther from the center than others, because it's the more extreme elements in both parties that will show up to vote in a primary election, where voter participation rates are quite small, actually.
Mm-hmm. One of the themes of the discussion last week, and that's a perennial theme these days in newspapers and in commentary, is the dire health of our democratic system generally. And sometimes it seems to me that one role that historians tend to play in public commentary, and to a certain extent some of the things you said here, is to remind a nervous citizenry that it has ever been thus, and that we shouldn't fret about how awful it seems today, because we can point to various long-term precedents that are deeply rooted in our political and cultural DNA, that recur time and time again in the same sort of ways. I wonder if you're willing, acknowledging your historian's preference to situate things in the long history, nevertheless to speculate on something like the current moment, say the decade. How parlous is the health of American democracy, situated historically?
Well, let me again respond to the first part of your question. Yes, you're right. Historians have a natural tendency, and I guess I've just exhibited it here tonight, to try to argue that things have been this bad or worse before, so let's not get our knickers in a knot. Mm-hmm. But that is, I don't want to be misunderstood as saying we should therefore just detach ourselves from the system and lose interest in it. I think the opposite lesson is the right one, that our system is so difficult to operate that it demands maximum engagement by those citizens who give a damn. So I hope I didn't disillusion anybody here with the description of how difficult our system is to operate. Okay, but your more immediate question is, are we in a peculiar moment today? Yeah. Well, there is a boundary condition for judging, a metric you might say, for judging the degree of division and paralysis in our society. And we have an historical example of it. It's called the Civil War. I mean, it's hard to imagine any more divisive matter than that. The political system failed utterly to contain and deal with the issues that bred the Civil War, especially slavery, westward expansion, closely associated with that. And we had a shooting conflict that killed more than 500,000 people. So it's hard to find an example more vivid and dramatic than that one. But I think some of you read a piece that I wrote called Throwing the Bums Out or something about swing elections in the late 19th century.
All of them read it, David. All of them read it.
Without exception, okay. Well, I needn't belabor or rehearse the point, but the late 19th century was a period of much bigger swings, more volatile elections, and more political paralysis than we currently have. Maybe not as attended by the same degree of vitriol and recrimination, but nonetheless, the functional equivalent was roughly the same. No party could control both chambers of Congress and the presidency for any appreciable period of time. And we survived through that period, although it was a pretty crummy moment in American history. It was a moment of great disillusionment of a lot of people. And when a lot of issues that were really building in their gravity, like how to manage the process of industrialization, how to manage 35 million immigrants coming into the country, 15% of the country foreign-born by the census of 1910, how to manage rapidly increasing urbanization, and so on and so forth. A lot of those issues were simply deferred. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we lived through a period when life was not at its optimum just because the political system couldn't come to grips with this. As I suggested in the piece, and maybe I was grasping at a straw there, we might take the volatility and paralysis of the political system in that era, as in our own, as willy-nilly a kind of index of the public's registration of how difficult and complicated these issues are, and the inability to really see a way through them, although still recognizing their importance. In the earlier period of history, we get a successor era. It's called the Progressive Era. It's usually marked by the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, when the political system does stand up at attention and we get some significant changes. We get structural changes, like the initiative, the referendum, the recall, increasing use of primaries, and we get substantive changes like the creation of a Federal Reserve System, Federal Trade Commission, Food and Drug Administration. I mean, the federal government especially begins to address some of these issues, address to which has been deferred for 20 or 30 years prior. So we can hope that our own time of political paralysis will pass into a period when things will look better.
Well, let's wind up our session with a question or two, much more now in the present. As I mentioned before, we're on the eve of the first presidential debate. Some of the panelists last week expressed the view that Romney's last best chance to shift the existing dynamic of the campaign is in the debate. You told us a story before about the increasing sophistication of presidential use of the media, and how this is a genuine moment where not everyone in the country watches the debate, but at the very least it is a common and very significant moment in the campaign. Can you tell us something about either whether or not debates have played any consequential role in elections, or how you are thinking about the coming square-off between Obama and Romney?
Well, there are three debates that are thought to be of some consequence in the outcome of the election. Nixon, Kennedy in 1960. Reagan and Carter in 1980, and especially the famous line, "There you go again." And George H.W. Bush looking at his wristwatch in 1992. And the press and the media, for all the understandable reasons, make a great deal out of those things because they make great stories and great images and so on. But the actual demonstration of their eventual electoral effect is a little bit hard to take at face value. So we'll know a lot better at the end of this month when the three debates have happened. It seems to me that if the press seizes on some faux pas or slip or gesture that somebody makes as fatal or as really inflecting the curve of public opinion, I think that'll be a big mistake. For one thing, as you say, not everybody watches these things. And probably more people pay attention to the spin that's put on them afterwards than the event itself. So it takes a lot of processing to figure out exactly what effect they have. I think we should have debates. I think it's good for the health of the republic that we have them. My own view is I prefer debates in which the questioners are professionals. I think the so-called town hall setting where the questions come off the floor are not nearly as effective as educational devices, because you can't, it's more difficult to control the quality of the questions than they can go anywhere. I happen to know that there are groups that have been officially asked by the debate organizers to prepare questions for the journalistic panels that are going to conduct the debates. So we're likely to get a pretty good quality of question, or set of questions that will be put to the candidates. I'll be glued to my television tomorrow night, and I suppose most of you political junkies will be too.
Let me ask a follow-up, because you talked a lot about media and the evolution of the presidency in the context of the media, and radio for Roosevelt, television for JFK, Reagan, brilliant TV guy. Clinton wasn't so bad on TV either. Question, do you think the media today and then you mentioned the twittering going on in the audience right now. But these guys have to, a third of the people have iPads. Do you think there's more or less or the same media influence now? There's obviously a lot more devices and a lot more media sources, but do you think that the media is more, less, or similarly influential than it has been over the last 20 years?
Jim, you're the modern media guru.
Right.
I'll put the question back to you, but let me make an historical observation, and I don't know what exactly to make of this, but just as a set of observed facts, I think it stands up. There seems to be a kind of cycle or interval of roughly a decade before the advent of any new communications medium and the person who figures out how to make really effective political use of it.
Yeah.
So you go back to radio. First radio station broadcast in 1920 or 1921. By the end of the decade, most homes in America have radios, but neither Harding nor Coolidge nor Hoover, the presidents through that decade, really figured out how to use it. Franklin Roosevelt comes on the radio, invents this thing called the fireside chat. It suddenly becomes obvious that the radio can be an enormously effective political tool, and he uses it to the max. But it takes about a decade for somebody to come along and figure that out. Fast forward a few decades, television's introduced in any kind of incipiently mass basis, approximately 1950. By the end of the 1950s, 90% of all American households have television. Harry Truman didn't use it very well. Dwight Eisenhower didn't use it very well. John F. Kennedy used it spectacularly effectively. Fast forward again a few years, you have the advent of the internet. That's around since the mid-90s. It took Barack Obama in 2008 to figure out how to make really effective fundraising use of the internet. That's how we financed a lot of his campaign. It made not only monetary but political hay out of doing it that way. But again, it took a decade or more before somebody really figured out how to do it. Now we're in the era of social media. We haven't been in it a decade yet, I don't think. So it remains to be seen who's going to figure out how to really get the leverage on that particular innovation.
Very interesting. So, and if you looked at it from, the question I was really going at is you have such a diffuse set of media sources today, right? And so many people now view it through their own channel, through their own lens. We'll get into that in other parts of this class. But you could certainly argue that makes media in an odd way less important than it was at a time of a Kennedy or an FDR, where there was one major broadcast source that everybody listened to.
Well, this has become a truism and a piece of conventional wisdom, but it's worth reiterating anyway. I believe in Cronkite's day, Walter Cronkite's day, and when he was at the height of his viewer audience, his Nielsen rating, his percentage.
We should ask how many of the students even know who Walter Cronkite is.
But some people in this audience know who Walter Cronkite was. He was the most prestigious, widely recognized, and respected news broadcaster in his day, 30 years ago plus back. And his Nielsen rating, percentage of televisions that were on, I believe is the way it works, that were watching him, was something like 29%. So roughly, round numbers, a third of the country was watching the same news source, and they had put great credence in it. They believed him. He was an authoritative figure, and 30% of the population got their news from that source. There were two other major network news broadcasts, and that covered just about the whole territory. Today, if I remember this correctly, the program with the highest Nielsen rating is American Idol, and its rating is about 9%. So what you're pointing at, and I'm just underlining what you said, what's happened in our time is not just mass media, it's the proliferation and fragmentation of the media. Yep. And there's a well-known psychological phenomenon called confirmation bias. We all have this, however self-conscious we are about it, we still have it. We give more credence to those voices that say things that we already agree with. And it's just natural, it's built into our nature. And so the proliferation and fragmentation of the media has, if anything, not weakened the media as a political actor, but dispersed their effect and made us more divided because we don't hear anybody else's views ever.
Rob, one question.
I'll wind up with just one observation. I want to ask the folks in the room thinking about media. Here's a relatively new device I just learned about this week. Raise your hand in the room if you're registered to vote. Okay. In this room, nearly everyone, but I see a few people who aren't. Perhaps some of the people who aren't are freshmen or sophomores here at Stanford who are really exercising their right to vote for the first time in an election. Here's something that exists on the web that you can now do. For people who grew up in one state and therefore can establish residence in the state from which they grew up, but then go away to college, you can now go online in order to register to vote in a very efficient way based upon the state where your vote will likely matter more. So you, as Stanford students, could, of course, register to vote in California now that you have an address here. But the likelihood that whether you're Democrat or Republican, your vote will actually be consequential in this election is low. Now, it's in a classic rational choice analysis, whether or not your vote will actually tip the balance one way or another in any state is very low. But the likelihood that it makes a difference in some certain swing states is much higher than it would be if you cast your vote in California. So we'll send out a link to this registration device for those of you who want to maximize the potential impact of your vote if you're eligible to vote in a swing state from which you hail.
So
thank you all.
Oh. Last closing question. So, because we're on the record, you know, we're going to be here. How do you think how do you think the debate will go tomorrow night, David?
I think it'll go very well.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Deal. Thank you. See you next week.
See you next week.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.